was a gentleman that called me one day in the office, and he said, Stacey, he said, I'd love for you to come out to my farm. And I said, well, sure. I said, what's going on? And he looked at me and he says, well, he said, I've got some cows dying. And for me, as a specialist, my heart kind of flutters when I get that kind of call. And I said, you've got cows dying? Yep. And I said, well, do you think there's a disease issue? And he says, I don't know. I said, is it nutrition? He said, I don't know. So I went out to the farm, and you're kind of on pins and needles when you go out on this kind of farm visit. And so I knew kind of where his property boundary was. And so as I got to that location, I started looking around. I'm looking for things, what possibly could be going on with this guy's place that's causing cow death. Now remember, this is winter time, maybe getting a little bit toward early spring, but it had been very cold. And so I was looking at these pastures, and these pastures looked kind of normal and this kind of thing. Nothing looked odd. And so drove on up to the house, and I was meeting him really at the lot of his, where the cattle was. And so, I was really looking at cows, and I was looking at the quality of the hay and the cows. I was looking at their condition scoring, and the condition looked pretty good on the cows. The calves looked good. Everybody acted like that they were feeling good. So, I went out and met the farmer, and we walked into the lot, and we was looking at the cows and could see nothing abnormal. I didn't see any snotty noses. I couldn't tell that anybody had drooping ears. I couldn't tell, that there was anything that looked really abnormal about these cattle. And so as I was looking at the cattle, I was also observing, the hay, and the cattle acted very content. Some were laying down, some were standing up, and they just looked like everything was perfectly normal. I noticed the hay in the bunk. There was plenty of hay in the bunk. And so, I thought, okay, that's all right. And I asked him, I said, are you supplementing the cattle any? And he said, no. He said, they're just eating hay. That's the only thing that they're eating. And I thought, well, that makes sense, okay. I had to ask him a few questions about a vaccination program. I heard nothing there that sounded abnormal. And one of the things that I'd kind of noticed is you always want to kind of look at the manure of the cattle and see how it looked, and it did look like that it was stacking up quite a bit. So I asked him some questions. Now, we had just come off of a cold spell, and that cold spell had been there, and I'd asked him when he'd lost cattle, and he said, about the time the cold spell had started, he had lost one, didn't think anything about it, and sometimes that just happens. You have a cow that just dies on you. Well, he wasn't overly concerned about that, and I said, did you notice anything? Did you have an autopsy done? Did you call a veterinarian? He said, no. He said, I didn't do any of that. He said she looked perfectly normal, just looked like she just laid down and died. And I said, what about the second one? He said, kind of the same thing, but he says, that's getting really concerned. I don't have a lot of cows out here. And I said, yeah, I'd understand that. And so we went around and we talked more about his health program. We talked about the nutrition program that he was doing. And I started asking him about his hay. And he said, yes. He said, the barn, and he pointed at his barn. He said, yeah, right there in the barn. He says, I've got 2 cuttings of hay. And I said, well, that's good. He said, I said, did you separate them at all? And he said, yeah, one hay cutting is on one end of the barn and the other's on the other. And I said, okay. I said, have you changed your feeding of hay? And he said, yeah. He said, I was feeding out of the one side of the barn. He said, I've switched to the other side of the barn. I said, okay, all right. I said, tell me about the hay. And he says, man, he said, they're identical. And he looked and he pointed and he said, that haystack come from this field and that haystack come from this field. And the only difference, he says, I fertilized them the same. He said, I care for them the same. The fields, and I noticed the fields, they just looked identical almost each other. And I said, well, why then did you do 2 cuttings? And he said, well, I work off the farm. And he said, I only had time to cut 1 hay field. And he says, then, I was off working, and he said, I come back home, and he said, then I cut my second cutting. And I said, well, when did you cut your hay? And he says, well, the one field I cut it on June the 1st. And I thought, well, that's not too bad. And he said, the other one I cut June 15th. I said, okay, which one were you feeding when the cows died? He says, that would be the later cutting hay. And I said, okay, anything else that you can think of? And he says, that's the only thing that I can think of. And I said, can we pull a hay test from both of them and we'll take a look at it? And he said, sure. And he said, Stace, what are you thinking? And I said, well, I think it may be a hay quality issue. And he says, but they're the same. And I said, well, there's a difference on the cutting dates on them. And sometimes when we get to a mature hay, or when the fescue is maturing, the quality really goes down on it pretty fast. And he said, okay, I'd be happy to do that. And I said, when we get the hay analysis back, then we'll look at it and see if we need to do something a little bit different, and not only the analysis, but we can take that and balance a ration with it. And he said, sounds like a great plan to me. So we got the analysis back. The one that was cut June the 1st had a protein level of about 7.4. And it had a TDN level of 59. Now for most people, they look at that and they say, you know, I don't really understand those numbers. Are they good numbers? Are they bad numbers? Well, let's take a look at the second hay. His other one that he cut June the 15th, his protein levels was 5%, his TDN levels were 45. Now notice that is a pretty big difference from 59 to 45% on that. So that was a huge difference, and that was the hay that he was starting to feed that the cattle had died upon. Well, here's a little chart. Most farmers like to talk about protein and protein content and what is adequate and what is not adequate. Now we've got cattle in different stages. If you look at this slide and you see the pregnant in the second trimester, so their pregnancy through the first 2/3 of their pregnancy, and then we got pregnant in the last trimester, then we have a mature cow with 20 pounds of milk, first 90 days of lactation, and then we have a first calf heifer lactating first 90 days. And so you can see as you look at this that the protein percent needs to go up as you change these different levels of cattle. When we start just plotting on there, the June 1st, the 59% and the 7.4% protein is where we're looking at it. And you can see that the 7.4% protein was adequate for pregnant cows in the second trimester. It's getting really close when we're looking at the pregnant cows in the third trimester, but we are just totally inadequate if we are looking at peak milk lactation or first calf heifer lactating. Just not enough protein. What about the June 15th? Then we put the protein levels at 5%, and we can see when we look at this that the protein levels are not adequate for that animal at any stage of pregnancy. And so we were just short on protein. That's only part of the story. The other side is the TDN, total digestible nutrients. And what we look at that, we're looking at the same stages of production as what we had before, pregnancies and mature and the heifers. Okay, let's plot the June 1st on it. The TDN levels are at 59%. Okay, we can see that that is an adequate level for the pregnant cows and even the cows that were in lactating. It was adequate for them. Now, if we were in our first calf heifers, it is not adequate for those animals. So our energy levels are looking pretty good on our first hay. All right, what about our June 15th hay? June 15th hay was TDN was 45%, and you'll notice that it is just not adequate at any stage of production. So these animals were energy deficient. We had had a cold snap. We had, it just wasn't adequate feed, not adequate protein, not adequate energy on them. And so that was what was going on. And you know, he looked at me and he still had trouble kind of understanding what it was. But Stace, I'm feeding him all the hay that he can eat. And I said, I understand that. But the fiber levels are high enough, and the density of the protein and the density of the energy is just not high enough for that animal to get enough in her system that she can eat all that she can possibly eat, and yet she can starve to death. Now that is just not a pleasant story to try to tell a farmer, you know, you're starving your animals to death, when he thinks that he's doing everything that he can possibly do to give those animals adequate amounts of feed. And so that can happen to just anybody. When we went out to the farm, I mentioned to you that we talked about looking at the manure piles, and that was the thing that really kind of gave me an indication of what was going on. Is we had what we called the wedding cake style of manure piles. they were stacked up, and this guy's stacks, they were really big. And I thought, okay, that was a thing that really kind of showed me or told me, we've just got a fiber issue that's going on here. We probably don't have enough protein. We for sure don't have enough energy to sustain those cattle. And you can see the pumpkin pies is there, and even the thinner. Those usually indicate that we're pretty good energy on it. And as a producer, you can go out and just kind of look at manure and see what you think may be going on. And it just gives you a chance to do better management.